Alrighty, Dan, look, we have a lot to talk about. There's so much going on right now with Donald Trump and everything else. There is nobody that I have met, maybe other than Alan Weisselberg, the former, or maybe even the current, nobody knows, chief financial officer over at the Trump organization, that knows more about Trump's money, Trump's finances than you. So do me a favor, because I understand that Trump now is listed at about $4.2 billion on the Forbes wealthiest list. However, that estimate of his net worth has dropped significantly over the years.
That's absolutely right.
So tell me if you would, how does Truth Social and that media empire, as he call it, how does that impact his current valuation?
Empire is a funny word for it, because although it does take up a huge part of his net worth, about half at this point, it's a tiny, tiny little business. I mean, this is a company that generates over the last 12 months $3.4 million of revenue and lost $380 million on a net basis. Okay, so far from an empire in business terms, but from strictly valuation terms, yeah, it's a very, very significant asset for him, although an extremely volatile one. And we'll see how much cash he's actually able to squeeze out of it.
Okay, I understand. So for my listeners again, because I want them, a lot of them don't fully understand how this publicly traded company now has a valuation of $4 billion, $3 billion. The numbers change every single day. How is it that a company that has a revenue, an annual revenue of under $4 million, give or take, with a operating loss of nearly $400 million per annum, how is it possible that with a net loss of about 400 million, how could you have a valuation of $4 billion? That's like 100 times lost earnings, not even net earnings, lost earnings. Explain this to my listeners.
There is no way to look at the financials of this business and come up with an explanation. Okay. This thing is worth that much money because something is worth what people will pay for it. And right now, post presidency, Donald Trump has crowds of people who are willing to pay him extraordinary amounts of money for things that have very little intrinsic value. Okay. Now, that's true for example, a coffee table book with photos sourced from, public images. It's true for digital NFTs of, him flexing or whatever. Those things aren't worth anything in the real world. But if people think that they are worth something, then you can generate a lot of money out of it. And this shows up most clearly in shares of the Trump Media and Technology Group, which is the parent company of Truth Social, Trump's Twitter knockoff. Now, this business should not, from a financial perspective, be worth anything like what investors are valuing it at. However, they have bid up the shares to extraordinary amounts because people who like Donald Trump are just excited by the idea of, hey, he's got a media company. I want to bet on Trump. They're not necessarily picking apart the financials here and saying, okay, what's a proper valuation? They're just saying, I want to own something that has Trump's name on it. And they're buying shares at prices that make no sense. But if you have enough people doing that, then it boosts the overall market value, market cap of this company. And given that Donald Trump owns roughly 60% of it, that leaves him with it's gone down the last couple of days, but, call it roughly $2 billion stake in the business.
Okay, so let's dissect this stock, this Trump Media and Technology, because actually, as I'm talking to you right now, I'm also following it on my stock analysis application here.
Yeah.
Over just the course of, let's just say, the past 6 months, since the announcement of this Trump Media and Technology Group, the public trade onto it, it opened up at somewhere around $70 a share, give or take. And right now it's trading at $15 flat. All right. You're talking about a 300+% decline over just the course of the last 6 months. That doesn't seem to suggest, at least to me, and while I am a investor in the market in stocks, I am not by any stretch of the imagination to be considered a an analyst of any sort. But I would venture to say that a 300% dip in a stock that's now at $15 a share versus its opening of $70 doesn't really lend me to believe that this is a stock too many people have a lot of faith or trust in. You agree with that?
Well, let me put it this way. At $15 a share, it continues to be way overvalued. And so there are still people who are buying these shares at numbers that are based purely on hope, purely on faith, not based on financials. However, certainly, I mean, the decline of the stock from the time that it merged with the SPAC that was taking it public to now has been a significant drop and has shaved billions of dollars off of Donald Trump's net worth. Now, if you look at that stock chart sort of over the months, what you'll notice is that when people are talking about the Trump Media and Technology Group and about Truth Social, generally the stock tends to go up. But it has sort of these momentary blips. Okay, this happened most recently last week. Donald Trump said, "I'm not selling my shares. There's no way. I don't need the money," which is not true, by the way, but that he does need the money. But who knows whether or not he's going to sell shares. And right then, that boosted the stock about 12% in a day, put over $200 million on Trump's net worth. All of those gains have since dissipated very quietly over the last few days of trading. And so what you see is these huge bumps, and then just quietly things fall back, not just to where they were, but and continue cascading below. And we've watched that happen over 6 months. And I would guess that it's going to continue to happen simply because, again, at $15, this stock is still way overvalued.
Well, today is a very special day for Donald because I believe today is the day that he can actually trade his shares. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the way that the rules work is if the stock is over $12 a share, inside investors after the 90-day lockup are authorized within which to trade shares. I don't suspect, based upon, even though the volume is like at 8.7 million shares traded for the day, that's not a whole lot when you have a market cap of $3.02 billion. But the stock is traded anywhere today from $14.77 all the way to a high of $15.09. I mean, maybe he's not selling off because he thinks that he could pump it up for another 50 cents a clip, which, as you said, at 50 cents a clip is like $250 million based upon the sheer amount of stock that he has in this worthless company. But again, I'm always blown away when I see a stock that is a fucking dog. I mean, that's the only way that they would call this on Wall Street. It's just a fucking dog. And not one of the dogs that the Haitians in Springfield, Ohio are looking to eat. This is one that you run away from. It's a piece of shit. I mean, there's what, maybe a couple of million followers or subscribers to this platform. It's so piss poor that he's actually back on X, formerly Twitter, using that platform. I'm going to go one step further, and I think you're the one who potentially uncovered this, that there was like a $10 million infusion of cash into this Trump Media and Technology by a foreign company or a foreign entity that is suspected to be Russian based. Tell us about that.
Well, there's been all sorts of problems with getting financing into this business because at the outset, it started with the premise that Donald Trump was not really going to invest his own cash. And the guys who came up with the idea were two former apprentice contestants. And they came to him at Mar-a-Lago and basically said, hey, look, you get 90% of this company and you don't have to put up anything of your own at the outset. Now, everybody knows that when you buy into a company, normally you have to put up some money, particularly if you're buying a 90% stake. Trump doesn't have to put up anything. And so what that results in is that these two guys have to go around trying to figure out how they're going to get cash. And they go around and ask some people that you would expect. So, there's a guy who's very heavily involved in sort of Texas Republican politics named Roy Bailey, who used to be involved with Rudy Giuliani on a business basis. So Roy Bailey was helpful in them both contributing his own money and then helping connect him with other investors. One of them was Kenny Trout, who's sort of a multi-level marketing telecom billionaire from Texas. Kenny Trout put in money, went to Bedminster and signed documents with Trump to put it in. But then there were some other sources that were more murky, and it's not entirely clear what the origins of those funds are. And as you say, there was one injection that came in that was particularly alarming to people inside the company. And we still don't know for sure what the ultimate source of the cash was, but some of the people connected to the entity that put the money in are people that certainly you have suspicions about, and have ties to the porn industry, questions about their ties to Russia, and so these are the sorts of people that are financing this endeavor. And then ultimately Trump says, okay, well, I'm going to go get this SPAC money, and that's going to put in nearly $300 million into the company. So then now I can actually go and create a business. Well, the SPAC that he ends up partnering with has all sorts of problems because according to the SEC, they had basically created this SPAC, told investors that they hadn't identified a target that they were going to merge it with yet, but in fact had, that it was sort of pre-baked to merge with Trump's company. And so that tangled it up in all sorts of investigations. Ultimately, the CEO of that SPAC was fired from his own SPAC and then was charged with fraud by the SEC. The SEC also required the SPAC itself to pay an $18 million fine to merge the two companies. And that's the source at this point of the bulk of the cash that the Trump Media and Technology Group has is that SPAC that's gotten all sorts of, investigations and fraud issues and all of that. But investors, again, don't really seem to care. I mean, they're just excited by the idea of this, and they're not necessarily looking at, okay, it had to pay $18 million, and that $18 million might mean that it has less cash to ultimately merge. None of that financial analysis seems to be playing in to the prices that people are putting on this. They're just saying, I want a piece of Donald Trump, and I'll pay whatever it takes to get it. But over time, fewer and fewer people have been willing to do that, and therefore the stock price has declined.
See, I think initially when they did the big announcement, this became like what's known as a meme stock, right?
For sure.
Where, where people just, as you said, they just want to have something to tie themselves to Trump because they are part of his MAGA base, including the stock certificate that says
Right.
Trump Media and Technology Corp. It'd be like buying a share of Disney. And it comes as a beautiful stock, right? With fucking Mickey and Minnie and whatever on the stock. And you put it inside of a picture frame. You hang it up on your wall, and it basically becomes or you put it up in your office, and it becomes like a conversation piece for $15. Not so bad, right? $15, and then you go to Walmart or to Costco and you buy for $5 a picture frame that's glass. So for $20, you have yourself something, not like the photos that you have behind you, where they cost more than $20 to do it. So in fact, they may be actually onto something here. I mean, not like these worthless NFTs, but you get
it's a fascinating concept, right? So the NFTs sell for $99 a piece, okay? And a share of the Trump Media and Technology Group sells for $15 a piece.
Right.
Now, which one of these things is quote unquote cooler to own? The difference is that if Trump sells an NFT for $99, the value of that is just whatever the initial sales accrue to him. In the
Zero.
case of a publicly traded company, the value, well, he's made a little bit of money off of it. But in the case of a publicly traded company where he owns 115 million shares, then whatever crazy price somebody's going to pay to put their little thing in a frame or just to tell friends, hey, I'm an owner of this company, then multiplies by 115 million. And that's how you get these massive, massive numbers for what Trump's stake is worth.
So look, I want to move and switch over to something that I too was very heavily involved with, and that was the New York civil fraud case. And in that case, it's known as the Tish James, the Attorney General case. A lot of that initially came out of my live public House Oversight Committee hearing, where they were really referencing some things that you had discovered early on while doing your Forbes analysis of Trump's net worth, of his financial statement of financial capabilities and personal financial statement. You turned around and you identified, as an example, that his primary residence at the time, his triplex apartment, was not 33,000 square feet, nor had any property in that building ever traded anywhere near like $15,000 or $12,500 a square foot. I mean, those numbers were completely off the chart, overinflated. I want to ask you, based upon that civil fraud case, revealing without any without any opportunity of anybody to cast any dispersions upon those findings, that his values were all overinflated. Do me a favor, if you would. Explain how this practice of inflating Trump's financial statements played a role in this civil fraud case.
Well, it was the whole case. I mean, if you look at how Trump did this, it varies property by property. And so if you look at the penthouse, for example, you take the number of square feet, you multiply it by 3 times what it actually is, and then you apply a crazy price per square foot to that property. But if you go through each one of his properties, and unfortunately for Trump, the Trump organization kept very detailed explanations of the math underlying its valuations. And those detailed explanations allow you to pick apart where they were just making stuff up, where their valuation methodology didn't make any sense. And so, for instance, like for a golf course, they might say, okay, we are welcoming in members at $100,000 a head. Well, in fact, they might have been welcoming in members at $25,000 a head, or in some cases at $0 a head. And then they would take that sort of puffed up $100,000 figure and they would say, okay, and we have another 300 spots that we can sell at this golf course. And so they would multiply 300 times 100,000, get to some extraordinary number. And then they would say, but that's not all. We also have bought all of this land. Well, that would be
before we go further. But wait, one second. But before we go forward, just do me a favor, explain to my listeners, because I really want them to get a full understanding. That's called future anticipated income. So if you would sort of give them the full professor, analysis here.
Sure. So, I mean, valuing things is a little bit of art and a little bit of science. Okay. There are a lot of different ways to go about it, but there are some things that are clearly sort of bedrock principles of how you value things. So for instance, if you were looking at the future income that you're going to get from a golf course, first of all, you would need to have those be actual membership initiation fees, not just made up ones. Secondly, you would need to have the correct number of slots that you are going to be able to fill. And thirdly, you would need to map those out year by year. How many ones you're going to fill in year 1, year 2, year 3, all the way through until it takes you to sell out the whole thing, call it 10 or 15 years. And then you would need to discount the income that you would get from those future years back to the present value. So if you are going to get $100,000 in 2050, well, guess what? No one is going to buy that asset for $100,000 today because they can't do anything with the cash from now until 2050. So they're going to discount that back to today's values. Now, the discount rate that you apply will vary based on what the interest rates are in the market. So if interest rates are really high, you're going to apply a very steep discount rate because somebody who would buy that would demand a higher return in that sort of environment than they would in a low interest rate environment. And so those things can fluctuate over time, but as you're valuing something at a specific point in time, you're going to need to be using actual figures and you're going to be needing to relate that discount rate to what the interest rates are at the time. And you're going to need to apply that discount rate. And in many cases, Trump just simply didn't apply any discount rate. He just treated all of this future stuff as if it were money here and now. And that's just, obviously not a decent way of doing evaluation.
But you were, I remember the very, very first time that you and I many years ago started speaking because it was very important for Donald to be as high up on the Forbes 400 list, that 400 wealthiest Americans list. And I remember you turning around and having what I would say is probably an entire 3-ring notebook of questions, trying to get an understanding and value. And I remember once you turned around and you said, I'm a little bit confused here because 40 Wall Street, you have that down as a 72-story office building in the downtown section of Manhattan on Wall Street, the famous Wall Street. But my evaluation of the building based upon records is that there's only 63 stories. Now,
correct.
One thing I was never aware of is whether or not they actually took the additional 9 floors and still multiplied as if those floors actually exist. But the question I really want to ask you, as a guy who has been doing this and is just so fucking good at it, how common are these kinds of exaggerations that Donald demonstrated, or I should say Weisselberg with Donald, in his financial records? How common are these with other individuals similarly situated to Donald?
Yeah, so Trump is one of a kind. And, there are some individuals who will exaggerate or push. I've valued hundreds of people over the years. And I would guess that maybe 90% of them want to be lower on the list. They don't want to stand out as much. They're hoping they don't make the cut because, you have to worry about security and that sort of thing. Actually, maybe 90 is too high. Maybe it's 60 that fall into that category. Maybe 30% just kind of don't really care. They want you to have the accurate number. It's like whatever. And then maybe 10% want to puff out their chests and make themselves look richer than they actually are. Typically, the people who want to do that are in either real estate or finance because appearing rich in those industries actually helps you make more money. In real estate, it helps you get loans for cheaper amount. In finance, it helps you convince investors that you've been really successful and therefore they should invest more money with you and therefore they can charge management fees on that money that they put with you. So from those two industries, you see more exaggeration than you do from other industries. But among that sort of cohort of people who might push things farther, Trump, there's only one like him. The consistency of exaggeration and asset by asset it's just, anytime that you hear a number, whether it's income, square footage, acreage, whatever, odds are it's going to be wrong. And so when you're doing your math, you have to go back and not just check those numbers, but you really have to go back and, find the numbers straight from the documents. And then if you want to laugh, look at what Trump told you. And then you base it, upon the numbers that are in the documents. Now, fortunately, in the real estate business, there's a ton of documentation. People are applying for permits, people are applying for mortgages. You see a lot more than you do in, for example, like an aluminum manufacturer or something like that. And so it's easier to sort of pierce through the lies with real estate because there is so much that's documented.
Yeah. I mean, I remember another topic that came up is one that actually was covered by a guy named Jeff Wise from the Intelligencer. You asked some questions about the shiny bauble that flies around with his name emblazoned on it. Now, of course, they spent a couple of dollars. They put the American flag as well on the tail wing, but he'll put down in that personal financial statement or the statement of financial condition known as an SOFC that that aircraft is worth $100 million. Now, why I bring up that Intelligencer article is because the headline on it is "For a Billionaire, Trump Flies a Crappy Plane," and it's the truth about his vintage Boeing 757. Now, a lot of people aren't aware because they see it flying and it definitely has a brand new shiny, paint job onto it. But as the old expression goes, it's like putting lipstick on a pig. While it looks good and while the interior is well maintained, it is a 1990 aircraft, first flown in 1991. I think there's been 2 or 3 owners before Trump. And that aircraft has a value of it based upon its age, the hull, the engines, the whole 9 yards, which is really the expense on that aircraft. You're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of under $15 million. And the article is very funny because they talk about other billionaires who are worth what Trump claims that he is worth, who are all flying around in like the G650s, the Falcon 9Xs, right? They're flying around in the Boeing business jets and so on, where they're paying somewhere anywhere between, say, 65, 70 million for a G650, upwards of 100 plus million for the Boeing business jet or a Falcon, right? I mean, so it is really kind of funny how you also drew that out and said, how do you value the aircraft itself, considering the most expensive part of the aircraft is the engines, the 2 engines. And even though they had, we'll call them lower airtime on them, they still were basically worth 2.5 to 3.5 million if FedEx was going to buy them, because FedEx is actually the largest owner of 757 Rolls-Royce engines. They buy every 757 because that's the aircraft that they use in transporting their FedEx goods, right? And so what they do is they constantly are swapping out and repairing the engines. So, they would be paying like $6 million or so for their, for these engines. So what brought that to your attention? I just thought it was funny how you basically ripped apart every single asset. Can I bring up one additional asset that you brought up? And that was 1290 Avenue of the Americas. It's also 1296th Avenue. And that's a great asset. It is a massive, massive commercial property with a massive footprint on Avenue of the Americas. But one of the things that you talked about is the income, the significant income that it actually brings in. One of the other things I think that has to be noted here is that Trump only owns a 30% interest in that asset. He talks about that asset as if he owns 100% of it. In fact, Trump doesn't really own 100% of any asset other than his golf courses. You take a look at 40 Wall Street. That may be the closest asset to what he owns single-handedly. That would not be true, considering it's a land lease, right? And even though it's a land lease with a German company, and even though that he does have a very long-term lease onto it, he still doesn't own the ground. to which it sits. The other properties that you see, whether it's a Trump Park Avenue, a Trump Tower, whether it's Trump, World Tower, Trump Palace, these are all condominium buildings. So yeah, he'll keep parts of it, like the roof that he rents out to like Verizon or AT&T. He'll keep a parking garage if there's one attached to that, or if there's a commercial space for a restaurant, he'll keep that too. But he doesn't own the buildings. The buildings are actually owned by the condominium owners under what's called a fee simple absolute structure.
Right. As you know, perhaps better than anybody. But yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, so I was going to say, so how do you use this information in evaluating his total net worth for purposes of Forbes list?
So each asset, you have to pick apart and figure out what exactly it is that you're valuing. So for example, in, the Trump International Hotel and Tower in Columbus Circle in New York City. So Trump, as you say, has sold off almost all of that building. What he still owns is a parking garage underneath. He owns the restaurant where Jean-Georges is. And he also owns antennas on top of the building. So you're really valuing only those tiny bits of the building. And if you value those tiny bits only, this massive building with his name on it that looks like it should be worth a ton of money is actually, for him, only an asset that's like $10 or $11 million. And he has debt on it, which is like another $6 million that comes out of that. And so you go through each asset and figure out, what exactly am I valuing? And it's certainly not what it appears from the street. 40 Wall Street is not the only one that's on a ground lease. Nike Town, the old Nike Town, 57th Street, is not on one ground lease, but is on two ground leases. And so you have to figure out, okay, how much ground rent does Donald Trump have to pay to the owners of those leases? When does that ground rent escalate? And you have to put all of that into the valuation to say, okay, how much cash could he be able to squeeze out of this thing in the future? And therefore, what is it actually worth? But in each case, it's a little bit different. You have to get really, really into the nitty-gritty details of it to figure out the final numbers.
And one of the other things I remember hearing you say when they were interviewing you on a television show, and that was right after the New York Attorney General case where Trump was found by Judge Arthur Engoron to have violated the law civilly to the tune of about $500 million. And we all knew that Trump was going to, of course, appeal this because that's what he does. Delay, delay, delay. But one of the big issues that arose is the fact that he did not have the money within which to post the bond in order to cover the civil fine that Engoron determined. Use that and explain to my listeners about this type of liability and what it actually showed about Trump, the property values, the financial consequences of the ruling. What was the big takeaway from the Engoron decision?
Well, it really put Trump in a bind financially because, we estimate that right now he has about $413 million in cash, which is for him, for anybody, but even for him historically, is a tremendous amount of liquidity. However, he also has significant legal judgments. There's not just the Engoron case. He also has two judgments in E. Jean Carroll cases. If you take all of those three cases and you tack on the interest, which is significant, that they have been accruing since those decisions came down, he's now up to about $566 million in legal liabilities. That is a much larger number than $413 million. And of course, you can't just, get rid of all your cash at once. So you need some cushion here. So then that leaves Trump looking for other places where he might be able to extract cash. And the trick for him is that his historic real estate business doesn't have a lot of easy places for him to pull significant sums of money from at this point. He just, they just refinanced 1290 Avenue of the Americas and 555 California Street in San Francisco. So that's kind of done. Trump Tower has a fresh loan on it as well. I can't imagine that would be super easy to refinance right now. 40 Wall Street, maybe this is the hardest of them all, largely because that ground lease is going to significantly escalate in 2033. And so that loan is going to be very, very difficult for him to refinance, even at the current amount of debt that he owes on it, which is about $119 million, let alone to take out a more significant loan, which would then give him some cash out. So there's the golf courses, however, do have the ability, he doesn't have a lot of leverage on those. But the trick with golf courses is that banks don't really like to lend against them. They're seen as much more risky assets than, say, an office building or a retail property because the golf business is unpredictable. And so the amount of money that you can take out of those, interest rates that banks would charge would likely be higher than what you would expect in sort of the traditional real estate business. So you put all of that stuff together and it's like, oh gosh, he's got a real cash crunch. But then lo and behold, the Trump Media and Technology Group merges with Digital World Acquisition Corp. And suddenly he has this massive new asset out of thin air. And now, although the value of that asset, sorry, go ahead.
No, you keep going.
Well, I was just going to say, although the value of that asset has decreased a lot, from $8 billion to roughly $2 billion over the time in which his shares were locked up. So he couldn't actually sell those shares and get access to that cash. Now, today's a big moment, okay? Because finally, assuming that the share price stays above $12, finally he's going to be able to sell those shares. And that could allow him to get a significant amount of liquidity back into his business. Now, the tricky thing for Trump here, though, is that if he sells, then people are going to say, oh, Trump's not into this business. And then the price is likely to decline. And the more it declines, then the less money that he can ultimately suck out of the business. So he's got sort of this high wire act right now where he has to convince his most ardent supporters that he's deeply committed to this company while simultaneously dumping shares on them, showing that he's not deeply committed to this company. Okay. But if there were one person who were able to manage that, who were able to sell people on this idea, and were able to sell that specific crowd who's likely to believe Trump and to discredit what other people say, it would be Trump. So there's a way that he can still suck significant amounts of money out of this, but it is a really, really fraught endeavor that we're going to have to watch closely over the next few months.
Okay, so here's the problem based upon the numbers as I see it. You're right. You have approximately $600 million in outstanding liabilities. The golf courses, as you appropriately and correctly stated, those aren't assets banks really have interest in lending on, unless that there's a development component, which is something that they're looking to do now at the Doral, because they want to come up with like 5,000 or 10,000 houses in the Doral area. I mean, you want to talk about just wishful thinking? Sure, no problem. The problem that you have with the golf courses is once Donald takes that bond money, you know that nobody ever sees that money back again. That's why they keep the number below what's called the return date number. And that's where for every one person in, the person who wants their bond back is able to get it. So that's not new money for Trump. So he doesn't want to do that. The whole thing is totally crazy. But let's assume, so now you have the $600 million in liabilities. The commercial real estate is failing. 1290 Avenue of the Americas and the 505 San Francisco property have already been financed out. He has that 30% interest. As I stated before, it's controlled by Related. So really, where's the cash coming from other than the Grifts? And you're right, it's coming from Truth Social. Today's episode is brought to you by Ollie. Clean, fresh nutrition your dog needs in 5 flavors that they'll absolutely flip over. You don't have to be a veterinary nutritionist to know that feeding your dog real, whole foods with minimal processing is one of the best choices that you can make for their health. A perfectly portioned, whole fresh food diet has been proven to extend your pup's life by 2.5 years. And who doesn't want more time with their best friend? With absolutely no harmful fillers, no preservatives, Ali is made in U.S. kitchens with ingredients carefully sourced from trusted growers and producers around the world. You see, because the time between Ali's gentle cooking and your dog's chowing down is minimal, they don't need preservatives to extend shelf life. With 5 protein first recipes like fresh beef with sweet potatoes, fresh turkey with blueberries, or fresh lamb with cranberries, you might start thinking, damn, my dog eats better than I do. And that's probably true when it comes to Ali. So I want to be clear about something. I actually don't have a pet. I don't have a dog, but I do have a neighbor who has the absolute cutest cavapoo that goes crazy for me whenever she sees me. And by the way, her name is Luna. So here's what you need to do. First thing that you do is you fill out Ali's 30-second quiz, and they'll create a customized meal plan based on your pup's weight, the activity level, and other health information. Ali crunches the numbers, and then they recommend the right recipe and the daily portions for your precious pup based on hundreds of thousands of real dog results. Now, for the first-time users, Ali will send out your pup's first box with 2 weeks, that's 2 weeks worth of meals and a guide on how to gradually switch them over to their new diet. Ali offers 3 meal plans to choose from. You really think that this is for a human? They offer 3 meal plans to choose from. So you can choose between a full fresh plan, fresh topper plan, or a mixed plan with their freshly baked recipes for your special fur puppy. They also have treats and supplements. So look, like I said, I don't have a pup, but I promise you that your dog will love it. In fact, I have a video of Luna chowing down the very first day that I brought it over to their apartment. So let me be clear now. Ali, they are offering a deal to let your pup taste test a personalized meal plan. So head right now to Ali.com and tell them all about your dog and use Cohen, and you'll get 60% off your first box of meals when you subscribe today. So head to Ali, that's OLLIE.com, and enter code Cohen, that's me, COHEN, to get 60% off your first box. Again, that's Ali, OLLIE.com, and enter Cohen to get 60% off your first box. And they offer a clean bowl guarantee on their first box. So if you're not completely satisfied, you get your money back. He also has outstanding liabilities on all of these properties. And if he wants to keep any of them, there's a better than likely chance now that he has been held accountable criminally on 34 counts. The bad boy clause on all of these properties are callable. And I suspect that there are banks that want to get the hell away from him. My suspicion. So hypothetically, if he ends up selling his stock in Truth Social, and it's not like you could dump, how many shares does he have in that?
114,750,000.
Wait, say that one more time.
114,750,000.
Okay. So let's say you can't dump 115 million shares into the market and expect that you're going to be able to get, let's say, $15 a share. Once it shows that he puts in, a sell order of 100,000 or 250,000 shares, it's going to automatically trigger everybody's computer system. It's all algorithmic run now. And there's going to be a short sale on this company that will drive the price down. So hypothetically, under the best circumstance, he pulls out $1 billion from this bullshit pump and dump fake public company that others have actually gone to prison for. But let's assume he pulls out $1 billion. That's not $1 billion that goes into his pocket. you have short-term capital gain on that. And in his tax bracket, it's 37%. Plus, there could be additional monies that are owed, considering he didn't pay for them. And it could be, let's just say, 40%. So that leaves him 600 million. After paying off his debts, he's still in the negative because, and you would know this better than anybody, Dan, all of Donald's liabilities currently today amount to how much?
Oh man, I do know that, but I would have to look at my notes. I would guess that right now we're roughly 1.3 billion, something like that.
I was going to say 1.2 exactly.
Yeah,
that's the number. It's about 1.2 to 1.3 billion dollars. In order to pay off 1.2, 1.3 billion for these obligations, you have to have 2.6, give or take, based upon, not only do you have the short-term capital that's federal, but there's also state, that in the state where this is incorporated, there's all sorts of money. So he doesn't have this type of funding that's there and available. I don't know what ends up happening to him based upon, even with the Truth Social sale.
If he were to sell those for $1 billion, which I think is optimistic, that he would be able to suck $1 billion out. So the capital gains tax is a little bit lower than the income tax. So he'd be paying like 23.8%.
I think it's 37%. Isn't it 37% is the top capital gain tax?
No, I think for long-term capital gains, I think
short-term capital gain?
Hold on a second. He might be able to call this a long-term. But
these gains are taxed as ordinary income, which is your personal income tax rate, between 10% and 37% on short-term capital gain.
Well, we'll see. But even if it were, let's say that it were even the lower one, and then it was 760, or even if it were the higher one, and it was 600. Let's say you pulled $600 million of cash out of it. I do think that, first of all, that would be very optimistic, and secondly, that would be enough for him to be able to sort of manage his way through this. Because remember, he doesn't have to pay all of that debt like tomorrow. The hardest one for him is going to be 40 Wall Street, which comes up in about next summer. That one's going to be a tricky one for him to figure out what to do with. But once he has that settled, and then once he has the legal stuff settled, if you put $600 million in, it's not like he'd be suddenly flush with cash. You're right. I mean, it would be still kind of a close call, but I do think he'd be able to work his way through that in that optimistic scenario.
Yeah, well, look, he's been successful many times over the course of his career in figuring out ways how to fuck over the banks, right? But one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and I want to sort of dive a little bit in this question into political relevance. So how do you think that Trump's media failures, including, of course, Truth Social, affects his ability to maintain financial and political relevance? See, this is a terrible thing for him. He always likes to be considered a winner, and he's clearly not a winner in Truth Social. So how do you think that this plays politically in terms of relevance?
Trump has always made a significant part of his persona how rich he is, how successful he is. And his financial troubles do dent that image. However, he, over the last, call it 6 or 8 years, has been very successful in convincing a cohort of the population that no matter what other people say about his business, that it's all nonsense, and that he actually is a great businessman, and he actually is super successful, and that it's not because his dad gave him a bunch of money, and it's not because of luck. And so I don't think that those people are going to be convinced that he is not a sophisticated business person because of more recent business challenges. Now, people who don't fall into that camp, yeah, I think that the world right now has a more nuanced view of Donald Trump's business acumen than it did, for example, in 2015. I think at that point, sort of the myth was very much alive and well that he, was a self-made man and, was everything he touched turned into gold and all of that. I think that over the last handful of years, as there has been, significant additional reporting in addition to insiders like you coming out and saying, wait a second, this isn't all quite as it seems, I think that people have gotten a more realistic picture of what Donald Trump's business acumen is. However, if you still compare Donald Trump to any one of his political adversaries and you say, okay, which person has more business experience, the vast majority of the country is still going to put their faith in Donald Trump, because although his business record is checkered, at least it's a deep business record and not, for example, a political record.
Well, okay. So that's a great point. J.D. Pritzker, richer than Trump, with a successful, right, big hotel magnate, the Pritzkers.
Also inherited.
Mitt Romney
Right.
with Bain Capital has been
Right.
nothing but a massive success, and so on. Obviously, Mike Bloomberg, though he's no longer active, but Mike Bloomberg, as former mayor of New York, 3-term, by the way, is worth what, $32 billion or something
way
like
more than
that?
that. I mean, he's up. I think he's up over 90 now. I mean, he's way.
Excuse me. You know, when he started out, right before he was mayor, I think he was like $2 billion, and then
Yeah,
by the time he finished being mayor, he was like $30 billion. I know that's a pretty good rate of return on your money being a mayor. You know,
he's an amazing case study. I mean, a guy who has made more money on Wall Street than virtually anyone, and yet he's not really a Wall Street guy. You know, he just sells like it's the guy selling pots and pans in a gold rush sort of story. You know?
And he's doing one hell of a job. But there's quite a few people who have entered the political arena who are certainly better businessmen, have demonstrated that. Also, they are not right now struggling with the issue of a criminal 34-count upcoming sentencing right after an election, but held accountable for 34 counts criminally prior to the election. My question is, how do you think that all of this, in terms of his legal troubles, how do you think that plays with his financial image, as well as, the way that he is perceived by
I think it's
not
all
just,
tied
of
up.
course, MAGAs, but also by independents?
I think it's all tied up. You know, remember his legal issues. Other than the the documents cases and the January 6th stuff, those are business issues. So the hush money stuff, that's a business issue in a way. I mean, you're paying off money to somebody to silence them. And so I think that there's this perception now, correctly, that Donald Trump's business and political worlds have collided in ways that are a little bit nefarious. And I think that is a damaging thing for him. But again, there's such a significant part of the population that does not believe sort of the neutral systems in place, whether it's the press or the courts, to suss out what's true and what's not, and just anything that happens in the press, anything that happens in court, is all just an attack on Donald Trump. So there's a lot of people who simply won't be convinced. And, how that all shakes out in November, I think it's a really, really difficult question. But look, there's no doubt that Donald Trump's, from both a financial perspective and a legal perspective, comes into this election in a much, much different place than he came into the only other election that he won in 2016.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I'm sure that a lot of my listeners right now, very much like myself, are we're just wondering. So you have a company. Let's go just back to Truth Social, right? To the Trump media technology company. They're losing, what's it, 300 and something million a year?
$380 million.
$380 million. Okay. And they're taking in revenue of about $4 million a year. So let's just even up that a little bit and say that they're only losing $375 million a year. So the question that I would like to ask a finance guy like yourself, what's the life expectancy of a company like Truth Social? Because they've plateaued at somewhere the neighborhood of what, like 2 million people on their social media platform, plateauing at 2 million people. How compare that now, for example, to X or to Instagram or to TikTok that have like a billion people around the world, or even here in the United States, they have 300 million followers, subscribers, and so on. They've plateaued at 2 million. I have 2 million on my social media platforms combined between YouTube, my YouTube show, the Michael Cohen show, TikTok, X, Instagram. I have more than 2 million people. Maybe I'm plateauing also. But my
And you don't
question
think you
is,
could sell it for a couple billion?
I don't know. Maybe. Why not? But my question to you is, they're losing all of this money each and every year, and they're now going into year number 2. How long can they sustain this loss?
Well, the question is, when do you run out of cash? Okay, so the merging of the SPAC brought in, after sort of fees and all of that stuff, call it roughly $250 million of liquidity. On an operating basis, they're losing roughly $125 million a year. Okay, so if you take that,
150.
yeah, so if you take that and you put that across maybe 2 years from now, okay, so then you're going to have some additional investments, some additional money coming in. Now, the most obvious way to do that right now, because the shares are overvalued, is to sell more shares. So sell it to more Trump fans. Hey, we want to, raise money to go create, Truth Plus and bring it on your TVs, not just on the app or whatever. And say we're selling it at $10 a share. It's a huge discount, and we're going to sell, 20 million shares or whatever. Now, I don't know how many times you can do that and sustain credibility. But it's that I think it'd be very difficult for a bank to, offer a traditional like corporate loan against this company. So, you're looking at probably a few years where they can middle along, and, maybe Trump is able to sell out a stake. Maybe he's not. And then ultimately, I think that this business will probably be either purchased by somebody else or will cease to exist because it doesn't have the cash to operate.
See, but again, like, I could understand why an Elon Musk would go ahead and buy, at the time, Twitter. I mean, they had massive, massive subscribership to that platform. You were buying not even an app, you're buying a media behemoth. I mean, we're talking about a fucking lousy 2 million people. I mean, it makes no sense considering his Twitter account has like 80 million people that follow him. If each one of them would have just gone over to Truth Social, but they don't want to. They don't want to. There's something that just sucks about that platform, whatever the hell it is. But Dan, I want to just ask you one last question here. As you know, the hour here on Mea Culpa, and I got a million questions, as I'm sure my listeners probably do as well. The guy is a bullshit artist, and specifically a bullshit artist when he talks about his finances. He talks about how he doesn't even need money. He can finance his entire campaign on his own. He didn't. Not only did he not, he actually made money off of running by charging the United States government excessive amounts to house his Secret Service protection, which he gets for free. He had to put them up in an office at 725 Fifth Avenue at Trump Tower, charge them like $115 a square foot when the average price there is like $90 to $95 a square foot. Charge more when they go to Mar-a-Lago when he's there and he's staying. he charges them not hotel.com rack room rate. He charges them the highest room rate that that could be charged, like $1,000 a night. I mean, he's running as a politician and making money off of us paying for his protection. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. But I want to ask you one final question here, because as we're approaching now the 2024 campaign, many people have the election. Many people have turned around and said, well, you know what, Donald, there's a lot of discrepancies from your financial claims to what we understand from media reports. What's the chance that he releases his tax return for 2023?
0.0%. We might see it eventually. We've seen some of his previous tax returns now because the House released it on the last day that the Democrats controlled the House, or one of the last days. They released several years of his tax returns, so we have a lot of them now. But the most recent ones, no, there's no way. Come on, you know that. No way.
All right, so let me ask you this then. So, if you have copies of what's the last fiscal year that you have a copy of Trump's tax return?
2020.
2020?
Yeah.
Okay. Have you actually dissected it?
Yeah, I've looked at it pretty closely. Yeah,
I'm sure.
It's a long thing, but there's more to look at. But yeah, I've looked at it very closely.
Sure. And just a quick analysis of what you believe that tax return actually shows, other than I know he paid like what, $750 in taxes, for that year. It's funny that people called me a tax evader when he paid $750 in 2016 and 2017. I paid $3.1 million. I mean, in taxes. I just find it comical, and he's like, yeah, well, I have all of these deductions. He takes deductions when no deduction is probably even warranted. But I would rather hear from you, an expert, on what you found in those fantastic 2020 returns.
Well, I think that the headline numbers are, that obviously make it look like he's not making much money at all. But the truth is that when you set the tax return data alongside the many other points of data that we have, particularly that show his operating income, you can see this discrepancy between sort of the real world and the tax world. And just because his tax returns make him look like he doesn't have any money doesn't actually mean that he doesn't have any money. He's not throwing off massive amounts, but people in the real estate business, have huge tax breaks that they can take. And he has taken them very aggressively, some of which, have reportedly caused significant problems with the IRS that are still under investigation. So, but ultimately, he still is rich, but his tax returns, you wouldn't know it just by looking at those.
Which is funny because my tax returns, you would think that I actually have money, but I have no money at all. It's really unbelievable. But I was forced to sell out my real estate holdings, and you have the recapture and all that. Basically, it took me apart and so on. Well, Dan, let me say thank you for joining me as always. I was watching television the other day and I saw this whole thing coming out about Trump's net worth, and basically, how 80% of his net worth right now is riding on Truth Social. And for that, I think it is comical. A guy could work, say, 55 years of his life, right? And literally in the last 6 months to make 80% of your net worth, right? At the age of 79 years old on a bullshit pump and dump public stock of a untruth social with under 2 million subscribers. Maybe you do have to take your hat off to him. I mean, it's truly, it's remarkable. It's an amazing, it is remarkable. Dan, thank you so much for joining me, my brother.
Thank you, Michael. Good to see you.
The same.